Welcome to Belfast Iconoclast. This week, Liz Nelson, one of the organisers of Belfast's candlelit vigil against Donald Trump's immigration policies, reflects on his first few weeks in office. Tell me about your demonstration against Donald Trump's immigration ban.
It was something that myself and another American activist, Jenny Carlston, were just kind of messaging one night, and right after it happened, just filled with this sense of kind of powerlessness that I think a lot of us Americans living over here often feel, particularly now with Trump, because we're not really sure what we can do. You know, we're far away from the big protests and marches that are happening, but we feel a need to do something. And there was very, very valid critiques, I think, of the Women's March, both before and after, kind of saying, you know, that this was great. This was a huge mobilization of mostly white middle-class women. And there was quite a lot of people saying, well, we hope that this kind of mobilization is going to happen for other issues that don't directly affect white middle-class women. And so I think it was kind of with those things in mind, recognizing that we couldn't just sit at home simply because this issue might not affect us directly. Although as immigrants, our you know, we have to be clear in understanding that our situation is an incredibly privileged one over here, and we're not by any means facing the kind of oppression that people, particularly refugees, are facing when they try to come to the States. I think as an immigrant, you have perhaps a little bit better understanding of what it means to try and make your home in another place and the precariousness that can sometimes go along with that. So, and we'd seen things protested at the consulate before, which to varying degrees of
efficacy, maybe?
Varying degrees of efficacy. But I think it was symbolic, really, protesting at the consulate. You know, we got critiques of that. It was outside city center. It was on a Thursday night. But being able to go to the seat of American diplomatic power in this little part of the world, a place that issues visas to people, where she and I have both had to go to get our passports renewed, it felt like that was the best place we could go to say, this isn't right. We want you to see that even from all the way over here, we know that it's not right. And we wanted to be as visible to them as possible and to stand up and say, this is not something that is being done in our names.
Did you get the turnout you expected?
Yeah, actually, and more so considering it was such a horrible night weather-wise. It was windy and rainy, and we got somewhere between 100 and 200 people, I think close to 200. I was really heartened, actually, by the turnout, because it is something that is very specific, I think, to the U.S., this idea of banning people from 7 majority Muslim countries. But it is also very relevant, I think, to the immigration debates and debates over refugees and asylum seekers that are happening here. And so people recognized a lot of that same kind of discourse that led to an action like this being taken, and recognized that the government in the UK and in Ireland are not exactly all that welcoming to immigrants or to refugees either. A recognition, I think, that things maybe could slide in that direction if they weren't paying enough attention, I guess. So I was really heartened to see that. And one of the things I said that night was to thank people for coming out in solidarity with and recognizing that there are U.S. citizens who don't believe in Trumpism, who don't believe in this kind of retrograde step, this discrimination against an entire group of people.
Have you seen an increase, do you think, in activism, maybe on social media among your own friends since the election of Donald Trump?
Absolutely. One of the biggest things I've noticed is that people that I didn't think were political or assumed were perhaps political in a different direction than I am have been horrified by the election of Trump and by the things that he's done in the first 2.5 weeks, I think it is now. And I think that has really opened a space for debate on social media and for perhaps contributing to the education of those who weren't very political before this. And I think that that's a really important and sometimes under-recognized thing that's been happening. And I think you can recognize that a lot of the mobilization for the Women's March was primarily white and middle class, and the critiques that are around that, and the fact that a lot of those people only came out into the streets because they're seeing for the first time that their privilege bubble is being threatened, and they should have been out in the streets a long time ago, protesting alongside communities who have been oppressed for hundreds of years. But that politicalization is happening now, and I think it's an important moment for politics in the United States. I think it's an important moment for activism that you have this space where people who previously would have said, oh, I'm not very political, and shut off from it, are realizing the consequences, I think, of not being involved in politics and what can happen when good people stay at home effectively.
Trump's made a few very surprising picks in his cabinet. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they're surprising, but I keep coming back to this idea that he told us exactly what he was going to do on the campaign trail, and so all these people who are saying give him a chance, maybe it won't be that bad, are I think being proven wrong. But yeah, I mean, some utterly atrocious choices. I think when you look at somebody, like they almost fall into two camps for me. So ones that are hateful because of their conservative ideology and their history, and ones that have absolutely no business in a government role because they have no competency and no experience. Interestingly, I think Trump kind of bridges both those categories. In the first one, the ones that are just purely hateful, I'm thinking of Jeff Sessions. So he's a senator, and he has an abysmal record when it comes to civil rights. He was actually defeated in his nomination for a federal judgeship back in, I think it was the late 80s, because of his appalling record on civil rights.
Elizabeth Warren had a few choice words for him.
She did. Go Liz. Yeah, that was pretty awesome. And so she was attempting to read a letter from Coretta Scott King, the widow of Martin Luther King Jr., a letter that Mrs. King wrote when Sessions was nominated for this federal judgeship, basically saying that his confirmation would be a travesty because of his record on civil rights, which is abysmal. And Elizabeth Warren was prevented from finishing reading this letter on the Senate floor because the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, a Republican, said that he invoked this really obscure rule within the Senate and said that she was impugning a fellow senator. And he came up with what is now an incredible feminist rallying cry. And he said that she was warned, she was given an explanation, and she persisted. And she was banned from speaking on the Senate floor for the rest of his confirmation. And interestingly, shortly thereafter, I believe that there were two male senators who read the rest of that letter into record, one of which was Bernie Sanders. I can't recall the other one. So I think there was some pretty interesting misogynistic double standards at play there. But on the other hand, Mitch McConnell and the Republicans have basically given Elizabeth Warren more attention for that particular issue than she might have had anyway. So Jeff Sessions, I think there was some hope that he wouldn't be confirmed, but he has been. Same with Betsy DeVos. Now she, I think, kind of goes in the other camp. Although on reflection, I'm not sure that there's much difference between the other one. She's incompetent, but she's also quite hateful. So maybe they're all hateful. I don't know. But Betsy DeVos is a billionaire, basically, who spent a ton of money on what is nicely called school choice. What that actually means, it's a school voucher program in a sense that gives, it's supposed to give families the choice to send their kids to a school outside their district that might be performing better than the one that they're actually in. Now, I'm not an expert on this program, but what I do know about it is that it really undercuts public schools. And the problem with public schools in the United States, if you don't know, is that school districts are funded in large part by property taxes. So what that means is that if you live in an affluent district, if you lived in an affluent area, your property taxes are going to be higher because the value of your property is higher. And so there's going to be more money going into your schools. Conversely, if you live in a less well-off district, the value of properties is lower. There's fewer dollars effectively going into schools. And so you have kids who are starting off disadvantaged from the moment they're born simply because of their postcode. And school choice, rather than, I think, helping families get a leg up, so to speak, in education, really just undermines the value of public education, which is really in line with that conservative ideology that nothing that the government does can be good, which obviously we know isn't true. So some of her Senate hearings were hilarious if they weren't terrifying and sad. She just doesn't know the first thing about education. She's literally spent her life trying to demolish public education. And she was very narrowly defeated, actually, in that two Republican senators defected and voted against her. So the Senate was evenly split on a 50-50 vote. And what happens in that case is the vice president casts the deciding vote in the Senate. Obviously, in this case, it was Mike Pence, and he, of course, voted to confirm Betsy DeVos. But that kind of near defeat is pretty unprecedented in terms of cabinet picks. By and large, Congress will approve the president's cabinet picks. And I think this kind of resistance that you're seeing among Democratic senators, I think we can credit that to a certain extent to the protests that have sprung up after Trump's inauguration. Because I think that senators who perhaps were maybe not agreeing with Trump, but were not necessarily going to put their necks out to resist these things, realized that actually their base is really fired up. And not just their base, people who see the Democrats as the only people that they have left to try and defend some semblance of values of equality and empathy and compassion and decency, what little is left of it in the United States. And they're realizing that perhaps they have a little bit more power than they think they do. And if they don't use it, I think there's younger people, more progressive people who are working their way up through the Democratic Party and indeed the left in general in the US who are prepared to push them aside, I think, and take the reins of the party and the movement for that. So I think you see that in the resistance against Betsy DeVos, against Jeff Sessions. There were a couple of other nominees where the Senate Democrats actually walked out of committee hearings, which meant that they weren't quorate, which meant that a vote couldn't take place. Now, in response, the Republicans, because they're majority, they simply changed the rules so that they didn't need the quorum. But what that's doing, it's forcing the Republicans to play dirty. It's forcing them to use their majority to do these things. In a way, I think you could say that the Democrats are to a certain extent doing what the Tea Party, what the Republicans were doing for years during Barack Obama. They're finally sitting up and saying, we don't have to just sit here and complain about this and then vote down party lines and not do anything. We have a certain amount of power. We have a certain amount of resistance that needs to be played, and the American people need to see that that's happening, and it needs to mean something.
What is the job of the Democratic Party at the moment? I mean, what should they be doing?
Resisting Trump in any way possible. That is a simple answer to a complicated problem, but that is their job. I don't think that there is any point going in and saying, let's just see what he does. I think that if you've been following Senator Bernie Sanders throughout throughout the transition and the first 2.5 weeks, I mean, it feels like 2.5 years at this point, but 2.5 weeks of Trump's presidency, and Sanders started out kind of saying, Trump campaigned to a certain extent on issues that would be a benefit to the working class, and if he's going to follow through on those things, then he will have my support. Some of the free trade agreements, I think, was some of them. But there were issues where it did seem like he was going to stand up for working people. He promised he wasn't going to gut Medicare and Social Security, even though every other Republican that you could possibly think of wants to do that. But one by one, those promises have diminished. He's appointed billionaires and, Wall Street bankers to his cabinet as his advisors. He's walking back on all the few little things that he said that he would do that might have benefited working people. And that's where you see Senator Sanders saying, well, no, if you're not going to do those things, then I'm not going to be with you on that. And I think that's as far as any benefit of the doubt for Trump could have gone. And that's over now, as far as I'm concerned. So what the Democrats need to do now is use every procedural weapon that they have in their power in Congress. Take a leaf out of the playbook of the Republicans over the last 8 years, of the years of Clinton as well, who were completely obstructionist, who pushed the United States to the brink of default because they wanted to get a certain provision in the the budget bill. Have threatened amendment after amendment to defund Planned Parenthood, or they wouldn't pass the budget bill, things like that, and really curtailed what Obama was able to do, thus pushing him as well to make a lot of executive orders in the way that Trump is. And I think, just as an aside, I think that criticizing Trump doesn't mean that we can't also criticize the things that Barack Obama did. I see a lot of people saying, well, you weren't up in arms about that when Obama did that, or, when he was abusing his legislative power, when he was bombing people in Yemen. And I say, yep, and we should have been. I'm not excusing that in any way. But the thing with executive orders is that they can be challenged in court as well. So you may push Trump to make a lot of those, but as we've already seen, his immigration ban has been stalled by a federal judge. And executive orders can't, their function is not to create legislation. So one of the ones in which he might have the biggest problem enforcing is the executive order in which government bodies were supposed to delete or get rid of 2 regulations for every one new one that they introduced, which is basically telling them that they should ignore the U.S. Code of Law that Congress has spent years developing. So that's going to be thrown out in court. So things like that, it may seem convoluted, but I think there's an important role for resistance within Congress itself. Outside of that, it's listening, I think, to the anger of people, particularly progressive people within and outside of the Democratic Party who are angry that it got to this point, because I think there's a lot of quite warranted criticism for the Democratic Party in the way that it handled its primaries and in the way that it handled Bernie Sanders and the the huge movement that he had kind of developed and the accusations that they weighted to the primary in favor of Hillary Clinton. I think they have a lot of work to do to bring people on side. Are they the best vehicle for it? I don't know. But at the minute, they're the ones that are in power in Congress. Well, not in power, but have the opportunity. And so I think we have to be pushing them to be more progressive.
One of the hallmarks of the presidency of Barack Obama was the focus on his statesmanship and also on his charisma, his public speaking style, how he handled himself in public, which meant that there wasn't really enough focus that was going on his policies, a lot of which were, quite detrimental, especially foreign policy. Do you think that there's a risk of that with Donald Trump, that if people just focus on his appearance, we won't really learn anything?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a certain amount that you can learn from his demeanor, but there's a certain amount of that maybe isn't meant as distraction, but could function as distraction away from the things that he's doing with policy, particularly the kinds of things that Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller are trying to enact from within his cabinet. So I'll come back to that. But first, just as regards his use of Twitter, I think on the one hand, we do need to be worried about that, about the way that he tries to conduct diplomacy or lack of diplomacy via Twitter. It's incredibly worrying, and I think it's dangerous. The other aspect of that is the tweets that go out that are targeting specific companies and people in the US. So it's not a small thing at all that he tweeted about the, as he said, so-called federal judge, the so-called judge who knocked back his immigration ban. It is not insignificant that he said it, and it is not insignificant that he said it via Twitter. Because what he's doing when he's using social media instead of the press is he's speaking directly to his base, as he understands it, unfiltered. And that means that those people who are consuming his tweets, who are supporting him, are not getting any sort of critical information about the policies that he's enacting, or critical information, fact-checking and the like, about anything that's going on within his presidency. All they're getting, all they're interested in, to a certain extent, is what he's tweeting. So I think it would be a mistake to completely disregard those aspects of his demeanor. Aspects of his appearance, I don't think there's any point focusing on that other than occasionally provide some comic relief. And I think we all need a little levity in our lives, but that's not an appropriate way to do it, because one, body shaming somebody, no matter who they are, isn't appropriate, even in politics, I don't think. But it does distract as well from the important issues. So back to Steve Bannon. It's really easy to get caught up in Trump tweeting, or, his hair or his suits that don't fit or whatever. But when we do that, we forget that he has a Nazi advising him in the White House. And things like the immigration ban, the immigration ban that was largely crafted by Bannon and Miller is very worrying, because we know that, from his history, that Trump is of fairly flexible ideology. So it matters who's around him. It matters what those people think. And Steve Bannon, interestingly, is another person that you could sit there and critique how he looks or whatever, but that's besides the point. And apparently the executive order that Trump signed, putting Steve Bannon on the National Security Council, which in itself is a completely ridiculous thing, was not seen by Trump practically until he signed it. I think that tells us some very worrying things about the way that he's conducting himself within the presidency. And so things like that are little clues that we do need to pay attention to, but perhaps not get overly bogged down in.
I guess one sign of Trump's incompetence is the fact that he and his cabinet have managed to isolate a number of very large and influential companies, especially, it seems, the entire tech industry, and put them at odds with his presidency, especially with the way he's handled this immigration ban. And I think yesterday or the day before, a number of companies such as Google and Apple and Microsoft and Uber signed a document saying that they opposed the way that things were being handled.
I think that's significant, but at the same time, I'm very wary of that kind of corporate activism. Mostly because I think people can fall into thinking that those companies are on their side when they're not. They're patently not. So while it's significant that Trump has upset people who really are his constituency, big businesses, and that they've taken this stand, to a certain extent, it's positive. But I think as well, particularly when you're talking about Silicon Valley, you're talking about people who live in an incredibly privileged bubble and who are only now speaking out about this because it's threatening them. But you don't see them speaking out about a lot of different issues that are affecting other people that aren't them. And so I'm wary of that. I have utterly no time for Uber at all, nor anybody that defends them. and I try to dissuade anyone I know from using them for a variety of different reasons. One, there's been several exposés on sexism at the very, very top of their organization. They undercut working people. They blatantly were scabbing during New York City taxi drivers were refusing to take people to JFK Airport at the height of the immigration ban when it first came out. And Uber dropped its price surging, which in and of itself, as a policy, price surging is horrendous. They dropped it and took people to the airport, undercutting this incredible act of solidarity by the taxi drivers. They came under so much pressure. Their CEO, I think it was sitting on one of Trump's advisory councils or whatever he was calling it, and only stepped down because they were taking a hit financially. I think that people were deleting their Uber apps. So Uber does not have your best interests at heart. Starbucks does not have your best interests at heart. Facebook doesn't have your best interests at heart. Like, it's great that these guys are saying stuff, I guess, but we need to be aware of what they're actually doing alongside of that. So Uber is certainly no bastion of progressiveness. I think it's more worrying. I think it's more worrying for Trump than it is positive for actual progressive activists that they've done this.
During the airport demonstrations and the strike by the New York cab drivers, it seems like there's like a great potential for actual change. It seems like people are more motivated than ever before to change things. And even though it's quite a pessimistic time, I think there are certainly seeds of hope there. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I think we need to remind ourselves of that when we start to get bogged down in this feeling of hopelessness, which is so easy when you keep reading the news. But I think one of the biggest things that's happened out of Trump's inauguration, I mean, the Women's March was one of the largest protests in American history. That's huge. That's not insignificant. With all the problems that it had, that's incredibly significant. I think people coming out in huge numbers after that to protest the immigration ban is very significant. I think the amount of people who've been calling their congressmen and their senators to the point where almost all of their inboxes, their mailboxes are full and you can't get through, I think that's significant. I think any time that you have people finally doing what we should have all been doing years ago and standing up in solidarity for other communities other than your own that are being threatened, there's a huge potential there. Things like the No Dakota Access Pipeline protests are another good example of that, and another place where Trump is running roughshod over what people actually want. I think that what is going to be very important in the coming months and years is keeping that momentum up and capitalizing on I'm not even sure whether the word is anger or fear or all of those things I think are rolled into one right now when people think about Trump. So, for example, there's a science march, like a march of scientists that's scheduled. I can't remember the date, but like because of the Trump administration's basically war on facts. And their censoring of people at the EPA and this kind of new catter of alt national park figures that are running social media campaigns telling people about climate change because all the data was scrubbed from their websites. I think that's huge. So I think people need to come out for that. The organizers of the Women's March, and this has not, to my mind, been as broadly celebrated or talked about as it should be. They're calling a general women's strike. They're calling for that in the United States of America. I think that's massive. I think that's massive in a country who is experiencing a huge decline of unions, some unions who voted for Trump. I think it's massive for a country that is mired in misogyny, who has a president who openly boasted about sexual assault. To have women standing up and saying, to have women standing up and using the language of working class struggle, of strikes, I think is potentially really impactful. Obviously, we need to see when it happens, how it happens, and hope that a lot of the critiques that were made of the Women's March are taken on board and changed. But that to me could be a potentially game-changing moment.
Liz, finally, the question of the week. Is it ever okay to punch a Nazi?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you're a Nazi, you should pretty much expect to be punched in the face at some point in your life. Yeah.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you have any questions about anything you've heard in the podcast, drop us an email at belfasticonoclast@gmail.com or send a message on our Facebook page, facebook.com/BelfastIconoclast. Of course, you can also tweet us at BeFastIconoclast. Thanks very much for listening.